Joint family property and its alienation. Under Hindu law, joint family property refers mainly to the ancestral, co-personary property of a Hindu undivided family, half, governed by the Mitakshara system. Alienation, transfer, sale, mortgage, gift, etc. of this property is strictly regulated, because it belongs not to one individual but to the whole co-personary. Alienation, the transfer of property, is a cornerstone of the Mitakshara school. The focus remains on who has the power to sell or mortgage the property and under what specific legal justifications. Meanings of alienation and modes. Alienation means any transfer of interest in property, such as sale, mortgage, lease for a long term, gift, exchange, partition, which is a kind of sanctioned alienation. Involuntary alienation, e.g., sale in execution of a decree, may bind the joint family to the extent of legal necessity or benefit of a state. Classification of property, meaning and kinds of joint family property. Under Hindu law, property is divided into two main categories. Joint family property, ancestral, property that is inherited by a Hindu from his father or great-grandfather, property in which sons acquire birthright. Mitakshara co-personary, it is held by the family as a unit. Property acquired with the aid of joint family funds. And accretions, means of joint family, such as brothers' share, gifts, or bequests for the family's benefit. Blended property, self-acquired property voluntarily thrown into common stock. Doctrine of blending, separate property, self-acquired, property earned by an individual through their own exertion. Gift, or willow without using joint family funds. Self-acquired property, however, is not joint family property unless thrown into common stock or treated as such by the owner. Separate, self-acquired property of a co-personer does not fall under these restrictions and can be alienated by him freely. Essential features of joint family property. Unity of ownership, no fixed share until partition. Right by birth. Community of possession. Fluctuating interest. Carter's control and management. Who can alienate joint family property? Generally, no individual member can alienate joint family property without the consent of all co-personers. However, there are three specific legal exceptions. The Carter, manager, position of the Carter regarding joint property. The Carter, manager, head of the half, manages the joint family property and can let out, lease, or mortgage property for short terms, protect and preserve the estate, incur debts, and conduct litigation. However, full alienation, sale, mortgage, gift, etc., of substantial interest, is not unconditional and is limited by three main principles. The Carter has a limited but special power to dispose of family assets. This power is not absolute. It is qualified. A Carter can alienate property even without the consent of other co-personers. Under three conditions, Indian courts follow the tripartite test for valid alienation of joint family property. Legal necessity, apart-kale, sale, mortgage, or other transfer is valid if done for legal necessity, e.g., to pay family debts, marriage of daughters, payment of government taxes, medical expenses, or other essential family needs. The necessity must be real and not fanciful, and must benefit the family as a whole. Benefit of the estate, kutumbarthe, if the alienation is in benefit of the estate, e.g., to pay off mortgages, invest in better land, or clear encumbrances, it is valid. Actions taken to preserve or improve the property, e.g., selling a dilapidated house to buy a better one, or defending a lawsuit regarding the land. Mere desire to convert land into cash is not sufficient unless it clearly improves the value or security of the estate. Indispensable religious, dharmartham, or pious obligations. The carter may alienate for religious or pious duties, e.g., performance of funeral rites, shraddha, pilgrimage, or the spiritual benefit of ancestors. Courts carefully distinguish between genuine pious duty and voluntary charity. If none of these three conditions is satisfied, the alienation is voidable at the instance of the other coparceners. Alienation with consent of coparceners. The Supreme Court has held that alienation of joint family property can be made only with the consent of all coparceners. Otherwise it is voidable. If the carter obtains free, informed consent of all coparceners, major and minor, the latter represented by a guardian, even without legal necessity or benefit of a state, the alienation is valid. B. The father. In addition to the powers of a carter, a Hindu father has a special power. He can alienate joint property to pay off his antecedent debts. Debts incurred prior to the alienation. Condition. The debt must not be avyavharika, immoral, illegal, or dishonest. Special position of the father, carter. Antecedent debts. A father who is the carter has an extended power, even if the debt was contracted by him for his personal benefit, not legal necessity. He can alienate JFP to pay it off, provided the debt is an antecedent debt. Antecedent debt. A debt incurred by the father prior to the birth of the son, or prior to the son separating from the joint family. Partition. Rationale. Sons are bound by the pious obligation to pay their father's antecedent debts to save their father's soul from hell. Post-2005 Amendment Impact. The Hindu Succession Amendment Act 2005, along with the 2018 Supreme Court judgment in Jaipur Development Authority v. Natwar Singh, clarified that this pious obligation is now restricted. A son or daughter is liable for the father's antecedent debts only if the debt was incurred before the commencement of the 2005 Amendment Act. Debts incurred after 2005 cannot bind the sons, daughters to the point of alienating their share in JFP. C. Alienation by coparceners. Other than the carter, a coparcener can transfer his undivided share but cannot transfer specific property without partition. Sole surviving coparcener. If there is only one coparcener, he has absolute power to alienate, since there is no other joint interest to protect. Multiple coparceners. However, if there are multiple coparceners, generally cannot alienate entire property, can alienate their own undivided interest. Subject to law. In northern India, Mitakshara, a coparcener cannot alienate his undivided interest without the consent of others. In southern India, Madras, Bombay, courts allow a coparcener to sell or mortgage his specific undivided interest for value. Female members cannot independently alienate. Wives, widows, mothers usually have right to maintenance but not coparcenary rights in ancestral property. Subject to statutory changes like Hindu Succession Act in some respects, they generally cannot independently alienate joint family property. Other coparceners may alienate their undivided share after partition. Generally cannot independently alienate joint family property without carter or general consent. They may alienate their undivided share after partition or when the jointness is severed. Essential ingredients for valid alienation. For an alienation to be legally binding, especially by the carter, the following must be proven. Existing necessity. The need must be real and not imaginary. Alienation is done for legal necessity, benefit of a state, or pious duty. Alienation is valid, binding on all co-partners. Inquiry by alienee. The person buying the property, the alienee, must act in good faith and perform a reasonable inquiry to ensure the necessity exists. Proportionality. Only as much property should be sold as is required to meet the necessity. Rights of the alienee. If the alienation is valid, the purchaser, alienee, steps into the shoes of the co-partner. They have the right to joint possession in some jurisdictions, or the right to sue for partition to realize their share. If the carter sells the property without necessity, the alienation is voidable at the instance of the other co-partners. The rights of the purchaser, the person who buys the property from the carter, depend on their good faith. Malified purchaser. If the buyer knows that the carter is alienating the property without legal necessity, the co-partners can easily evict the buyer through a reclamation suit. Bona fide purchaser. If the buyer acts in good faith, pays adequate consideration, and has no notice that the carter lacked the authority, the law offers some protection. Legal position. Even a bona fide purchaser does not get absolute title against the co-partnery. However, the courts often refuse to evict a bona fide purchaser if the JFP has already been divided. Partition has taken place before the suit is filed. If the property is still joint, the co-partner's right to reclaim generally prevails over the bona fide purchaser, but the carter will be personally liable to compensate the bona fide purchaser for the loss. Burden of proof. Burden of proof lies on the alienee. Buyer, transferee, must prove existence of legal necessity, or that he made bona fide inquiries. Remedies against improper alienation. If a carter alienates property without legal necessity or benefit to the estate, the other co-partners can suit for injunction to stop the sale before it happens, suit for setting aside, to declare the sale deed null and void after the transfer, right to partition, file for a formal division of the property to protect their respective shares. Nature and effect of alienation. Valid vs. voidable. This is the most frequently tested area. If alienation is for legal necessity, benefit, duty, the alienation is valid and binding on all co-partners, including those who were minors at the time, and even unborn sons in the womb. No co-partner can challenge it. If alienation is without legal necessity, benefit, duty, the alienation is not void. It is voidable at the instance of the aggrieved co-partners. Who can challenge? Only a co-partner, or, pre-2005, a widowed mother in some cases, whose share has been affected can challenge it. A stranger cannot. What is the remedy? The co-partner can file a suit for reclamation, asking for the property back, or for partition, asking for a separate share and adjusting the value of the alienated property against the carter's share. Time limit. The suit must be filed within 12 years from the date the alienating carter dies, or from the date the co-partner attains majority, or from the date the co-partner becomes aware of the alienation. Limitation Act. Courts may also consider bona fide purchaser position under the Transfer of Property Act. But the underlying Hindu law doctrine of legal necessity, benefit of a state remains paramount. Important case law. Supreme Court rulings. Alienation of joint family property without consent of all co-partners is voidable. The carter may only alienate for legal necessity, benefit of a state, or indispensable religious duty. Sale to meet daughter's marriage expenses recognized as valid where it satisfies legal necessity. even if sale occurs after the marriage. Leading case: Hanuman Pasau Pandey v. Babu Munraj Kunveri. Right pointing arrow laid down the doctrine of legal necessity and validity of alienation. Pious obligation doctrine. Now limited. Sons were liable to pay father's debts not tainted with immorality. Modified by Hindu Succession Amendment Act 2005. Doctrine largely abolished. Alienation without consent is valid if, for legal necessity, benefit of a state. Otherwise, voidable at the option of other copartners. Conclusion: joint family property under Mitakshara law is based on collective ownership and birthrights. Alienation is allowed only under strict conditions like legal necessity and benefit of a state. Courts ensure a balance between managerial powers of Carter and protection of copartners' rights. Especially after modern statutory reforms, the law regarding the alienation of joint family property is a delicate balance between protecting the family's collective wealth and allowing the Carter to function effectively as a manager. While the Carter enjoys wide powers to deal with the property without consent during emergencies, these powers are strictly fiduciary. The 2005 amendment has further democratized this space by turning daughters into copartners, giving them the same right to challenge unauthorized alienations as sons. The golden rule remains: consent of all is ideal, but the Carter's necessity justifies exception.